he takes the original theme of E1 M1, which is in E minor,
Yeah.
and then he takes it all the way down one or two octaves even to D minor, and he slaps on, I think it was a 6 string bass.
Oh, nice.
And it's
I
much
think I heard about
slower,
this. Yeah. Yeah.
and it's even rougher, even stronger than the original E1 M1. This is the Legend of Aaron Tsang. Going into the process of composition itself, and to your time developing those compositional skills and style, why did you choose U of T's music program? And to what extent has the program changed the way you composed overall?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, it's not a hard choice to make if you're in Toronto. Like, you can go stateside and it's like, let's spend $250,000 every year to go to some school in the States, right? As a local sort of kid growing up in Scarborough at the time, yeah. What was the most serious music school that we had at the time, right? It was just like U of T, done. Like that was like from a high school student's perspective, right? So if you get in, you go, right? I think it was like at the time, I looked up a bunch of the composers I looked up to, where there was like, James Horner or Howard Shore, who was doing the Lord of the Rings stuff at the time, right? Like John Williams, obviously, and what I found with all these guys was, they all basically had classical training, right? They went to Juilliard or wherever, right? And so it was like, oh, okay, cool. So there, you don't need to go to film scoring school. There's apparently no such thing. You just get classical training and write for orchestra classically, and go figure, right? Because film music, especially in those days, was pretty purely orchestral. Um, so that was just like kind of like, yeah, that's what I'll do. And it was in some ways to the disappointment of the school that like I wasn't actually interested in being a composer, right? That I was just kind of going here to learn how to write music so that I can write music for film, right? But there was just there still isn't really a serious sort of option for film scoring, right? Where you really get the proper compositional training. I think U of T, like most sort of conservatory style, music faculties, is still very sort of trapped in that, modern, postmodern, avant-gardism kind of sort of aesthetic. So most of the professors in most of these schools, not singling out U of T, I think this is true of pretty much any secondary school, sort of what do you call this, post-secondary rather, environment, is that most of these professors are from an era where the legitimacy of your music, is extremely tied to being in that style. So, we're talking about things that are more deliberately dissonant and not total, rhythmically challenging, that kind of stuff, right? And experimental within, those parameters. And so, I had to learn how to write in that way as well, which is useful because there are times in film where you want some chaos, right? But I think that, otherwise, there's sort of a big themey, you're talking about nostalgia earlier from the orchestral music from the video games. That would not really sit well with that that kind of culture, right? So I think U of T was again, like, not unique in this way, right? Was very academic, and as a result, it wasn't actually the most compatible training for what I actually really needed to do, right? But the good thing was that while I was there, I was just doing so much work, right? So I was constantly, delivering cues for clients and video games and all this kind of stuff, and TV commercials, TV shows, movies. That it was always a well-oiled part of my sensibility, right? What the university training though did give me was just lots and lots of critical tools to deconstruct things, right? And so just my musicianship itself was greatly improved from that whole experience, right? So I could like listen to things and figure out what the chords are very quickly. That, you know, I can listen to things and figure out what the orchestration was relatively quickly. I can look at a style of music that I'm not familiar with and deconstruct what are the sort of, you know, and style is just rhythm, right? Like by and large, when you say what a style of music is almost entirely a rhythmic thing, right? So you kind of get very good at deconstructing, basically, right? And that's a very, very useful skill, necessary skill in media composition, right? Because a video game might sometimes be cute and cartoony, sometimes it might be really dark and serious fantasy, it might sometimes be really silly, and you know, so like it can go anywhere, right? So I've had to make music in all kinds of genres that I have no business writing music. You know, I mean, like there would be like, oh, this is a DLC to the game where you have a holiday island vacation and we need to have reggae or something like that. You know, it's like, and it's like, so it's certainly not my background, but like I would, you know, do a bunch of Googling and YouTubing and sort of consume as much of that as I can, and kind of what's the common denominator? Okay, these are the kinds of things that typically happen rhythmically, and you know, look at some Wikipedia pages, you know, and generally, you know, because with that ability to deconstruct so efficiently, you can emulate styles outside of your comfort zone, and so long as your production skills are, you know, the mix and the master and all this kind of stuff is still very, very strong, people will generally be convinced, right? It's also just a silly video game in the end, so it's not, people aren't looking for the most authentic, you know, expression of something, right? So yeah, I think that was very, very useful. And I think it's asking all the right questions, right? When you go through that kind of rigorous academic training, where I think if I did not go to school, I would be a lot slower, right, at doing that. And so that's very, very, very useful. Yeah. The scene hasn't really changed as much as you'd think, even though it's been so many years now. That largely, you know, media music still doesn't really have a comfortable place to you know, you can go to Berkeley and they have like a you know, in Boston, and they have like a film scoring program, right? But that's kind of the unicorn sort of example, right? But like there's not many schools that sort of unapologetically teach film music, you know, as an actual discipline. So yeah, I think looking back, it was absolutely the right choice. I don't think you know, anything else would have served me better. And here I am. So you know, and I'm not the first, right? So like Mychael Danna, who won an Oscar for Life of Pi, right? He graduated from U of T as well, right? So so there's, I think that's just always going to be the pathway for film composers, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the ability to deconstruct so many different genres and to be able to compose in those genres convincingly without necessarily having the background in those. That brings to mind Christopher Tin.
Okay.
And I think you might know where I'm going with this.
Talk about the Civilization guy, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
With Baba Yetu.
That's right.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is that, so the entirety of the Lord's Prayer is in Swahili. But he was so able to convincingly convey not just Swahili in the lyrics, but also to match the rhythms that are more native to the African continent or to the local areas of that rhythm, and the vocalizations as well with the chorale or the choral part of it, that it really, even outside of the release of Civilization, I believe it was Civilization 3 or 4. I forgot what was the exact.
Yeah, that gets performed a lot. So it's probably been several iterations ago.
Yeah. It won a Grammy Award.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it won a Grammy, and it was the first video game music to be not just nominated, but also to win a Grammy. And since then, they now have a new category for at the Grammys for video game music.
That's right.
As a whole. So that immediately comes to mind for the ability to go between not just different genres, but also different languages too. His composition for Civilization 6's main theme, Sogno di Volare, was essentially a modernization of one of Leonardo da Vinci's poetic works back in those days, but it's modernized into modern Italian. And he was able to do that and convincingly put that into well, Western orchestration.
That's
And I
right.
find it so fascinating because this is, again, you need to have that frame of mind. And I can only imagine that, similar to you, he would have also had that ability to to deconstruct to such a level, such a quick level, and such a smart level that it just conveys such a strong response or an emotion, a response in so many different people who listen or watch these sorts of performances. Over the time over at U of T,
Hmm.
compare your musical style before U of T, during your bachelor's at U of T,
Mhm.
during your master's at U of T, and then after U of T. How have these periods of your composing career been similar, and how they've been different?
Yeah, I don't know that I break it up. The degrees were kind of a blur. I think like to me, the master's was just 2 more years of bachelor's, frankly, right? Um, I was growing very quickly. I think from year to year, I was a very different composer. Um, just because I was just doing so much work. And by the time I got to my master's, I was actually barely in class because I was I had just way too many deadlines for work that kind of I had to sort of prioritize that. Um, but I still finished my thesis, which was like this big orchestral piece with taiko drums and based on my wuxia novel that I stopped writing. Right, it was so it was like a big piece. I actually mounted it with I put it like my friends and I put it like just all the other music students we knew put the orchestra together and we mounted the whole piece, right? And it was really really cool. I think that the yeah like I think you just know so little. There's so much to learn in composing, right? Um, that that are entire categories of knowledge, expertise. It's kind of in some ways an unfair job in the sense of the amount of things you need to know, right? Like whether it's even just computer knowledge, right? Like how do you build a computer in those days that can actually handle writing orchestral music through VSTs? I had to like daisy chain two computers I built myself, where one computer was like a slave computer for the sampler, another computer was the sequencer in order to have enough horsepower to like run these sessions through, MIDI cables connecting them together and all. Like there was just so much you needed to know, whether it was, orchestration, counterpoint theory, history, right? And then there's all this appropriation because we're talking about like even the civilization music, right? How that had to like, you know, Christopher Tin probably doesn't speak Swahili. You know what I mean? Like, so it's one of those things where you have to become very sensitive and um immediately capacious of things that are outside of your knowledge, right? Like, and then be able to metabolize it quickly. And that comes from having many different continents of knowledge that intersect, right? So yeah, there's just a lot to know. So then it's kind of like, oh, you got to work on like writing better rhythms. Oh, I got to work on like having less square symmetrical phrasings, right? I got to manage. I got to not be so exhausted mentally from orchestrating, because sometimes if you're new to it, like just a vertical slice of music, it's just like, okay, all these instruments and the chords and who to play which note and what time signature am I even in? What key am I in anymore? Like, what's what I mean? Like, if you're not really fresh, right, and if you're not on top of all this multitasking that it requires, it's very very mentally draining to even do very simple things, right? So, and part of what the job requires is like is to be able to write very complex music in very very short turnaround times, right? Like even the COVID era convocations at U of T, I was commissioned to write all the orchestral music for. It was like an hour of orchestral music for those convocations, right? Like, and I was given like a few days to write all of that orchestral stuff, and it needs to sound good, mixed well, right? It's all MIDI programming, but I need to massage all those performances like so that they sound as close to real as possible, and it has to be timed to picture. It has, and you're given really a day or two to do all that, because by the time the edit is done, often they're so behind and it's like, yep, we're streaming this tomorrow. And so you're always on these tight timelines, right? Like and it's true in Hollywood all the way to the top. Like famously, like Troy, which is like a 2000-ish movie, right? I don't know, you probably know the story, right? Where Gabriel Yared was the composer on the film, and he was kind of like let go without him being notified 2 weeks before the screening of the theatrical release. And James Horner came in and was hired to write a completely new score because the producers were unimpressed or not satisfied somehow with the existing score. And James Horner wrote like an entire 2-hour film score to this movie in 2 weeks, right? And recorded the orchestra and everything too. Like it wasn't just the writing of it, right? Like mixed into the film and all this, and then it made it to theaters on time. And so that's the kind of crazy that happens, right, in this industry. So not only do you have to be, I guess, good at your job, you have to also be like unreasonably fast. And it's an activity that inherently cannot be done quickly. You know what I mean? Like because there's just so many things that have to line up, right? You're threading so many needles at once. And I think so that the only way you can do it that quickly is to have done so many 10,000 hours worth of it that there's no shortcut, right? You just have to do so much of it that you become extremely immediate about all these different parameters of composing, right? And yeah, so you're thinking about a lot, right? Even will this mix, and it's like, oh yeah, this is getting a little congested at 250 hertz. I need to compress this frequency, or I need to sidechain this. There's just so many technical things too on a production level that makes this otherwise seemingly classical orchestral thing work, right? And you're not going to have time / money to hire a mixing engineer to spend another week with it, send it back to you, right? You have to do it all yourself, right? So, and then maybe you have a soloist. So you have to bring a soloist into your studio and put your mics in the right place and learn proper recording technique and mic, and that's even how, funny enough, it led to the Juno win, which was like quite an unintended accolade, right? Yeah. By the way, I was not the composer for Going Home Star. Christos Hatsis, who was my mentor, was the composer. I was the mastering engineer, but I was also the sort of the programmer of a lot of the electronic elements in that score, because it was like half orchestral, half like electronic, right? And yeah, and so the fact that I would be hired to be a recording engineer or a mastering or mixing engineer for other projects so much now, right? Quite unintended. I had no, intention of getting into that space, right? I in high school I wasn't like, I want to be a mixing engineer. That was never my goal. But because I had to learn how to do it so much for my own work, I ended up getting my 10,000 hours in that space as well. And now it somehow it's become something that, if anything, if I'm being honest, I get hired more for sort of wingmanning other people's projects where I'm recording and producing their things than I actually write myself now, which is actually very, very convenient given the teaching schedule that I have with U of T, right? So, but yeah, so there's all to say, there's just so many things you need to be proficient at in order to kind of do the job at all properly, and I think that's that's, I don't know what the path. It's sort of mind boggling, even having done it myself, right? It's kind of like, this is not the best analogy, but you know how, like, if you know how to ride a bike, and now it's so easy to you because what do you mean? You just pedal and it just balances itself, right? And if you were to like try to teach somebody who's really struggling to balance on a bike, you would have not very good advice to give them. Like you wouldn't even know what to tell that person. It's like, I don't know, just pedal and it'll balance itself, right? Like you wouldn't have anything useful to tell that person who's struggling, because it's so natural to you now. But it's actually like it's such a, then it redawns on you how hard it is, right? It's like, right, like this is actually impossible to learn. Yeah, and I think it's a little bit like that. And so I think the challenge of even teaching composition as well, right? Now, because now that I'm on the other side, now I'm at U of T teaching, right? Yeah, that keeps me fresh, in some ways keeps me sharp, right? But it's easy to forget what makes it so hard. It is a lot to know. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a parallel also in the legal profession, because you have very experienced lawyers who've been doing this for decades, and them trying to convey it to someone who's just entered the profession.
Yeah.
Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it could be lost in translation, because why don't you just get it? Just do it. But for a first timer or a first year or second year, or even third year lawyer, if it's their first rodeo, it's a whole different world. It's, how do I even write? I have to write in a certain way, a certain legal document a certain way. So
And law school doesn't teach you how to practice law; it just teaches you how to think.
yeah,
So in many ways, you have literally no understanding of what the actual bullet points of things you have, what the actual process is. So you have to learn on the job, and that's very, very stressful.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so you have, and I think school in general is like this, right? Like, it's like you're given a lot of training, you're doing a lot of reps to make your brain bigger, I guess. But the actual how do you do this part is rarely very clearly delineated. So by the time you're actually learning how to do it, it's often when you're already hired and you're on the job, and then you're like, oh, so this is how you actually draft a contract or whatever. Where it's like, and I imagine my sister's a lawyer as well, and she had much the same sentiment where like almost all of the actual doing the practice of being a lawyer is kind of learned outside of school, I think, right? Would you say that's true?
Yes. I have yet to meet a single lawyer from any time period that will say otherwise. We all say law school doesn't actually prepare you how to practice law.
Yeah.
It prepares you how to think like one. And I would even argue it recently, that's even debatable too.
Yeah, it doesn't even do that.
It's just the quality. It just throws you a whole ton of books and whatnot, I guess. But no. So yeah, law school doesn't really prepare you for the actual practice. It's the only way you can actually get good at practicing law is by doing it. But
right.
You also need a good mentor at the same time to help you through that process. Right. So I'm still quite new to the profession myself. Like I graduated law school in 2021.
Right.
It's called the bar in 2022. So I'm able to do some things on my own, but I still need to have the time to develop even more on top of that. Right. So at this point, again, it all comes down to experience and it's that, again, that level of growth and that level of being able to going back to what composers have to go through, be able to think on the fly and have the capacity to consider different areas in a short period of time, especially if you're working in a small firm or in a large firm, or a private firm in general, you're billing by the hour.
Yeah.
So your time literally is money. So there's that. It's learning under pressure, but at the same time, not necessarily that much pressure.
Well, I think the machine sort of figures it out, right? So if you are not up to it, you will just find another job, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, and I'm sure there are people who leave, right? So I think that's always going to be the same everywhere. I think like law school is already very specialized. It's like you do a degree first before that, generally, right? At least here, not everywhere in the world, but it is, to me, school is just the lobby of doors, where you can sort of window shop on all the things you could do. And I'm sure even with law school, it's kind of like, well, there's so many different kinds of law you could practice, right? You're not going to learn how to exactly do all of those things, right? Like while you're in school, you'll learn about them. And it's then sort of the job of the school at best is to leave all those doors ajar. And you won't walk through the vast majority of them, but it's then that's when the real learning begins once you graduate, right? And I think that's that's the most we can hope to do, right? Now that I'm an educator on the other side of it, like I don't think you can just drop them in the deep end, because that's not necessarily the deep end that you even want to be in, right? Because you have to be all things to all people at the onset, right? You're still in the lobby, right? These people can go anywhere, right? And not all composing is as sort of user unfriendly, I guess, as what I described. Like you could be in a more narrow space that's a little bit less broad, right? Like I think media composing for video games and TV is very broad. But you could just be, I don't know, the writer of all the songs in a rock band or something, and that's still composing music, but it would be the sandbox you're playing in is much more defined. and so you don't have to step outside as often unless you want to, right? And then it becomes much more clear what are the things you have to know, and then that's it, right? You don't really need to know how to write for French horn, let's say, you know what I mean? Like, and then there's like instrument ranges and all this kind of stuff, right? Like if that's playable, or it's like, oh, actually this is in the instrument range, but you actually can't jump to this note because it's not possible on that instrument to do that, or like you can't trill between these notes. Like there's so much, just even like technical instrument knowledge of writing for orchestra, where you learn the hard way, because a musician will come up to you and it's like, what you wrote here, that's not possible. And that happens a lot, right, when you're starting out. So there's even that, right? There's a lot of learning by micro failure effectively, right? So I think if that doesn't somehow deter you, then you know, then yeah, that because that weeds out a lot of people. I feel. Yeah. Yeah.
It,
So
it
that, yeah.
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 Yeah, it's that yeah, the ability to like we were both saying, the ability to think on the fly and to be mindful of all these limits at the same time while also not having all the time in the world to do it, even when having a very tight schedule. That's no, absolutely that does weed out a lot of people. And it's also, I think, one of the reasons why even in law, but even before going to law school, when you apply for it, it's so competitive.
Yeah.
Because law school, if it does do one thing well, is that it's voluminous. It's not necessarily the fact that law is difficult.
It's
For
dense
some,
though.
for most people, for many people, it is. But I think for most people, it's really the volume,
Yeah.
the sheer amount of reading, the sheer amount of summarizing. That is what is, and frankly, it's an important skill because when you practice law, what are you doing? More reading, more writing. If anything, one of the most important skills in the legal profession is your writing.
Yeah.
Because before you even get to the court, you need to write in a way that is compelling to the judge.
Mm-hmm.
Whether if it's going to trial or if you're going to a motion or if you're going to, if in mediation, you're talking typically to a mediator. So you will have to write in a way that conveys your point correctly, accurately, but also compelling, especially if you don't exactly have all the strongest arguments in your case. You still have to say, yes, but this is what's happened to my client, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's difficult. And that requires lots of training and lots of practice in order to get to that point. And
I think, sorry to interject, but I think there's a bandwidth thing too, right? That gets trained because I think a lot of legalese, especially to someone like me who's not legal literate, it's like looking at a physics equation. It's like, there's just a lot of these words like notwithstanding or no, right, where it's kind of like it's inherently cumbersome to describe even when you are describing it properly, and it's so easy to lose the plot when you're reading that kind of stuff if you're not extremely used to it. So then in terms of the way you present it is like, how do you with respect to the legalese, make it really compelling, as you say, to someone who would otherwise go cross-eyed from this kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And to be fair, mediators, I would say 99% of mediators are also lawyers. So being able to write to them, they would get it. They would understand it because it hits certain parts that they need to hear from, or they need to see from that specific case. It's more of talking to the clients that becomes the issue. And early on, first year in law school, they teach us, don't talk to your clients in legalese. Talk to them in common language.
Right.
I would even want to say even vernacular almost, but that's maybe pushing it a little bit, but basically common English.
And that's actually good practice for you too, right? Because then it's kind of like, if you can't put it into plain English, then maybe you don't get it. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's this is yet another important skill in communication that we would need to have as lawyers. And I could imagine even as musicians, for as composers, you would have that similar sort of standpoint as well, being able to convey that to a person, to a director or a producer that doesn't have musical training. It's would be a similar thing as well on that point.
Yeah. So life is life. And this is the thing ultimately is like anything that's compelling is the same metaphor. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, it doesn't matter if it's music or otherwise, right? Like, and really at the end of the day, it's like, if you can maintain the, like a finger in the pulse of what that metaphor is, like throughout the expression, then whatever you're expressing has value, still has value, still has meaning, right? But the moment you lose track of like that relationship with, with the sort of the greater metaphorical abstract, right? Once you lose connection with that, then you don't have anything, And I think that everything needs to be a metaphor for life, and that is a sort of it takes on a form that can be applied to just about anything, in all the most complex and all the most simple ways, right? So even when you're talking about like earlier, talking about like playing Chopin with bel canto or something, right? The cantabile, the singing style. Like, what is that? That is where if you go from a low note to a high note, it should be difficult for an opera singer to just pop up to that high note. So maybe that high note is late, right? The left hand ostinato continues, and you have to kind of constipatedly reach for, but yeah, and there's a kind of like reluctance to enter that note to express that the resistance, the physical resistance it takes to actually get up there. But if you just, but it's a piano. That's an artificial effort. You just go pop it. There's no reason why you can't just get there immediately. But that being able to embody that, right? That kind of that kind of effort, which is compelling to somebody who's even outside of music, right? It's like if you're climbing a mountain or something, right? It's like, yeah, like getting higher is a lot of effort, and then being able to embody just how much effort should this be, right? Intuitively, is when you have something, right? And if you're not doing something that is metaphorical to life in some kind of way, or life experience in some kind of way, then it has no value, right? So, yeah, I think that's why there can be universality, right? To go back, right? That you're even as I'm saying all this, you're like, yeah, it's just like in law, which is not the most obvious place you would expect a parallel, but it's like it almost proves the point even more, right? It's like, yeah, it literally doesn't matter what you're looking at. It's kind of all the same ideals, and the way things optimize, right, is always the same. Yeah,
I think one of the issues that affects both music and law, and I would also even say sports announcing as well, is that we make it look easy.
Right.
Because we make it look easy, people think, oh, why don't you just do it this way or that way? To use some examples, when I listened to your graduation fanfare for U of T, you mentioned how it took you only a few days. Well, you only had a few days to orchestrate, instrumentalize, and compose the entire piece. But to me, and I would say to most people, it sounds as if you spent 6 months on it, because it's so, I mean, number one, it's really good. And number two, it's so polished that it doesn't even appear to them like it was rushed at all. And another example is, well, Mick Gordon with the Doom soundtracks, the modern Doom soundtracks with Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal.
Yeah.
So people hear it and it's like, whoa, not only is this the heaviest of metal, this is a whole different sound that's so unique as well. Yeah. Where, for example, he would take E1M1 from the original Doom. And then
I love how specifically you know these references. Amazing. Yeah. I'm very impressed.
Thank you. He takes the original theme of E1M1, which is in E minor.
Yeah.
And then he takes it all the way down 1 or 2 octaves even to D minor. And he slaps on, I think it was a 6-string bass.
Oh, nice.
And it's
I
much
think I heard
slower.
about this. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's even rougher, even stronger than the original E1M1.
Right.
And then he conveys the sound through most of the tracks, even bringing back some of the original themes from the original Doom game.
Yeah.
And then he creates a choir of rock and metal singers. And he even incorporates Mongolian throat singing into the track as well. That unique sound takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too much into what happened between him and the publishers, because eventually it all fell apart. But
that's the less interesting part in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. He was sent through, and he talks in detail about how much time he was put into the grinder when it came to getting the music out. And it was rough. Extremely rough. But to us, it wouldn't sound that way. It would have sounded like, my goodness, he would have spent a good year on this, but no. And that's, I think, the problem. It's a good problem to have, but it's still a problem.
where do you, what do you mean more specifically? Where is the problem? The fact that
the
like
problem it's that for people, because they think it's so easy, it's like, oh, I can do it.
Right.
And this is a person who has no training, or who's someone who's suffering the Dunning-Kruger effect of, oh, I have a little bit of training, so I'm thinking, oh, I think I can do it with that little bit of skill. But no, it takes, what you hear is the result of what you mentioned as tens of thousands of hours of experience and experimenting in your studio and learning in whatever music degree or conservatory you came from. It's a lot of experience and work, blood, sweat, and tears put into whatever project that you're listening to. But many people don't know that story.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't, like, I want to be clear though that you don't have to go through that to still be a composer and find work and all this, right? Because there's, every day there's a few million games released on Steam that are not needing to be at that level musically, the soundtracks, right? Like, and I think it's fine, right? I don't, really, there's all things can happen in any dimension, right? Of complexity, and that doesn't make it any better or worse musically either, right? But it's just, like there are in certain corners of this work, it can be highly demanding in a way that's hard to describe and do it justice, in terms of how much it is. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of it though is also just the understanding of the listener. So to clarify what I mean by that, it's not the listener being the understanding one, but the composer understanding what a listener actually perceives. Because if I say to you, it was a quiet, cold forest after the rain, as a description to you, what did you see, daytime or nighttime?
I would normally imagine this to be most likely in the evening.
Right. That was my intent. But notice I didn't mention time of day. And your brain will not allow for those kinds of variables to be unfilled, generally, right? So like, even in music, like if I hold a D and an A on the piano, like in the low register, and I have some noodling melody that avoids the F or the F sharp, so you don't know if it's D major or D minor. There's a way to do that where you move in such a way where everyone hears D minor, even though you've never declared the F or the F sharp yet, and this goes into orchestration as well, where it's like, well, you don't need the whole chord all the time. And so a lot of magic is happening, and a lot of data is actually populating in the listener's brain that is actually adjacent to only the crucial data that I'm actually presenting you. You know what I mean? And part of the expertise of composing, I suspect writing too, like if you were a novelist or something, right? Like exactly the same, right? Where it's like, like I know what you're seeing, right? And I know that that I know what you're seeing, so I'm going to raise you. There's this kind of game that's being played between the creator and the consumer, listener or reader or whatever, right? Viewer even, right? Like that you feel listened to, you feel understood by the creator, and as a result, you're kind of complicit in the creation of this experience. And I'm counting on it as a creator. I'm counting on the fact that you're going to populate. I'm counting on the fact that you see that forest as nighttime, and I don't have to even say it. And part of the weight of it is that I don't need to say it. Because if I have to tell it to you, then it's less magical, right? Like there's kind of like, oh, I made it nighttime, like, and I think that's what starts to happen, right? So even in pop music, at the very, very highest level, like the top 40s pop that makes millions of dollars, like, it's surprisingly sparse. It's surprisingly, if you really analyze what's really going on, it's a lot of what's not happening, and maximizing those gaps, relational gaps. And that's when like you're being led by a master, so to speak, right? That's where something about this is so confident. And where this confidence comes from? Confidence comes from not having to double check things, not having to be explicit about things, right? Like it's like this has such a clarity of direction that I'm vibing because clearly I'm not being told what's happening. I just know somehow, right? And that the more you leave it up in the air like that, the in some ways the more confidence it'll sort of appear to have. And yeah, anyway, so I think that's not even, it doesn't even matter what genre of music you're in, right? And I think when you get to that level, even with the Mick Gordon stuff, it's like, yeah, like he's probably consumed more metal music certainly than I have, right? But just to such a high voluminous as you say, right? Extent that he knows exactly which are like the shortcuts that he's I only need to do this out of these 10 steps. I only need to do step 2, step 6, and step 8, and you still see all 10 of those things, right? Like it's like, and it's like that just comes from being so steeped, right, in that culture. And so I think you have to have a very big appetite for information effectively, right? Like, and I think that's true for law as well, right? I mean, everything is very long-winded and you can't get lost, right? And part of your expertise is the fact that you can be given that much data dump and you can be quickly on top of all of it still, right? And then an untrained person would absolutely struggle with that, right? Like there'd be no way they wouldn't even know where to start with this mountain of data, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And a couple of points on that. First of all, it's musical advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I say it is because there's yet another parallel in law, where in legal advocacy, that's how we write. We're taught in law school to write for your audience.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you writing for?
Yeah.
Are you writing it for a judge? Are you writing it for a mediator? Are you writing it for your professor? Are you writing it for your family? Are you writing it for yourself? Are you writing it for... So the audience is important, and being able to at least know what the expectations of that audience is, that informs the way how you formulate whatever written piece that you are writing.
Mm-hmm.
So musical advocacy, I think, in your case, is a direct parallel with legal advocacy, especially written advocacy in that sense as well. And you mentioned how, especially at the top levels where you can go through steps 2, 6, and 10, that also brings to mind also some of the parallels in musical performance.
Mm-hmm.
So when I had Jonathan Crow on an earlier episode of my podcast, he mentioned how when he was still studying music, he was invited to perform with the great Yehudi Menuhin, one of the greatest violinists of the 20th century. And apparently, Menuhin was so good at controlling his body and his movements through the violin, he could look at a piece and play the next day.
Right.
No practice, just, I don't want to say sight reading, but basically almost like that.
Yeah.
Where he can just play it, boom, done. And Martha Argerich, a pianist, considered one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century, if not of all time, similar deal with piano, and especially with Chopin. And given that she's one of the long-time jury members of the International Chopin Competition, similar deal as well, with such incredible control over her own hands that even high-level pianists are just like, wow, how do you even do that? I think one great performance that she did was, I think, one of Scarlatti's pieces. I think it was a sonata. I forgot the name of the piece, but she was probably in her 70s at that point. This was back in the 2010s, I believe, or late 2000s. It was an encore performance, so she's already played a full program at that point. She literally walks in, she throws her handkerchief onto the piano and just plays Scarlatti, and it's also all running notes as well. Yeah. So lots of scales, lots of modal scales.
Nutrient dense, yeah.
Yeah. And the cleanest performance of that piece that I've heard compared to anybody that I've ever heard.
Right.
She's in her 70s.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's that at some point, it's also that, I mean, talent eventually becomes that point, because there are a lot of people who practice and who get to a really high level, but then there's some who just a whole different area, a whole different realm of prowess that it's, wow, us mere mortals are not able to emulate.
I think I actually have an explanation for this, right? I think it's I think when we learn things, even small things, we face this new information, we consider it, we we actively think and sort of fight it, right? And then we figure it out, or so we thought we figured it out, right? And then we kind of forget about it, right? Because it just enters our bloodstream, we metabolize it, and it's no longer front of mind. And then, like, days, months, years down the road, you realize you have it still, and that sort of like deep embeddedness, right? It's the reason why you can go home and put your key in the keyhole in your door without stabbing a bajillion. Like, think of how precise that actually is, right? That's like even the basketball rim is 2 times the diameter of the ball. I think about that, right? And people miss all the time. But you're talking, you come home, your key goes into that keyhole perfectly every time. You don't even look at it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, and what is that? So are you talented? It's like, no, you're, like or like it's 3 a.m. and you need to go take a piss, right? And it's all dark in the house, and somehow your hand just goes magically finds the light switch no matter where you're standing, right? You don't see anything, but you know exactly where it is. And it's like that kind of thing where there's so many muscles in your body involved in that precision, right? But it's like you're it's not even something there's no brain juice being spent. Like, you're not even thinking about this. It just will work. And that is like how deeply metabolized that information is, right? So if you take it, and I think this works even for, like, especially for someone like a Martha Argerich, or where, like, maybe somebody called in sick and now she's like the replacement performer or something like that, and there's a whole concerto she's never played before. It's like, hey, can you play this, tomorrow, last minute? It's like, yeah, sure. It's on the plane. She looks at the score. She doesn't even have a piano, and then, like, that kind of thing. There are all kinds of musicians that can do that. I think it's partly that for them, it's just a pile of keyholes and light switches that they already know where they are. Like, it's like, so it's a lot of highly complex shorthand where, like, entire giant chunks of music is something that can be crystallized as a single shorthand thing. Like, it's like, and that's why you might see it's like, oh my God, this is like 2 hours of musical content. How did you learn it on the plane ride here? And it's like, yeah, but because for them, it's like 7 items, like, and I think that's like, yeah, like if it's super compounded, right? Because you've just done it for decades. Yeah, I can sort of, I think that starts to sort of explain away a little bit, at least, or I think that help me understand, like, how people can do it, right? Like, certainly for me, a lot of things that I have naturally, like, and students are often very, very, it's a parlor trick, right? Where they show me something I've never heard before that they think is cool, and then I proceed to go to the piano and just play it, after hearing it once. It's like that kind of thing where it's like, yeah, like, I'm not actually a genius. It's just that there's a system that it's living within, and I know that system really well, right? It's kind of like if I told you to spell the sentence I just spoke, you could. But, like, how often are you asked to do that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, but you don't have to act, but it's not like at any given point, you're always worried about how to spell what someone is saying. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, but if somebody does quiz you and it's like, oh, hey, how do you spell the sentence I just said? Like, you could, right? And that's kind of like how at that, because the fluency of the language has been so deeply embedded, right? That, and it's not mind blowing to you, right? That you could do that. But for someone who, is not literate at all in the language, probably would be blown away, right? So I think there's an aspect of that where there can be a lot of virtuoso in that in fact is actually probably a pretty natural human ability. It's just that it's so many layers compounded that we can't even imagine it,
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I also have some personal experiences with that too. Mm-hmm. So in my past, when I was still performing and still preparing for the Canadian music competition, over a decade ago, this was during my early high school years, and even some parts of my middle school years as well. Mm-hmm. Whenever a classmate were to tell me, "Hey, can you play this theme?" I play it for them right on the piano with some ornamentation off the top of my head at that point.
Very cool.
Like, I'm able to do that as well. So for me, I'm like, yeah, I relate to that. And there are even some pianists out there who have only a few days or maybe a few weeks at best to learn a whole repertoire for a composer, but they play it out so well. And then it's just, they get better as they get through each performance. And I think that's sort of also what both you as a composer and myself as a performer back in the day, I think that's also an implicit lesson that we learn at the same time, that unwritten skill that we have, where you're able to catch that melody on the fly or catch the harmony on the fly and then be able to create it in a way with the appropriate amount of counterpoint that makes sense, that is compelling to people at the same time, as we were talking about.
Right.
And even in the non-musical spheres, I found that this is also, and I also have a personal experience of this as well. So if you were to show me a hockey game right now as a sports announcer, I can go off the top, like right now, if it's 30 seconds of overtime, here we go, 30 seconds of overtime right now. Puck won by the Carleton Ravens with Jennifer Simkowski in the top side. Here she comes with the pass towards Jenna Mitchell. Mitchell back to Simkowski, back and forth passes. Simkowski one-timer shots, hits the crossbar, rebounds off to safety. 15 seconds left on the clock. Here comes Simkowski again. Back over to Mitchell and back over to Shannon Pearson. Pearson shoots. She scores. Yeah. That sort of thing. Like right. For me,
that's amazing.
It comes.
Thanks for that. That's very satisfying to experience. Yeah.
So like, you're very welcome. So for me, to be fair, I've done sports announcing for a good number of years that I'm able to do that. But because of that, I realize that now I can even call certain games. And look, I'm not the first person to do this, and I won't be the last person to do this either. And frankly, it's not anything special. But it's sort of one of the things that sports commentators, and such as myself and also my colleagues as well, we learn that as we go on. We find the pacing with each sport and how we can adapt to those. We learn those on the fly most of the time, because many times, especially early on in my career at least, I didn't have a chance to even announce those sports or even play those sports. So it's very much learning on the fly. If you have a chance to learn from previous announcers who have announced that sport and maybe get some style tips from them. But at the end of the day, you're the one on that mic in front of the camera, if there is a camera, calling that action. So it's that adaptability and versatility, I think, that is such an important skill in really any area.
Because you have to make a decision quite intuitively about which details to not talk about, because they would take too long to explain it properly if you only have 15 seconds left on the clock, right? It's like you know, so you kind of have to like let certain things go. I think a lot of learning these kinds of more complex things that you can't be reductive about explaining how it's learned, right? Like is fastest to, you know, through osmosis, right? Like it's actually unremarkable, because in some ways everyone does it. It's like if you heard a pop song as like a non-musician normal person, you know, you might hear a pop song once or twice, and then you kind of sing along to it and you somehow know all the words already, or you sing the wrong notes, but you come up with equally musically functional alternatives that you thought was the melody, right? Like it's like, and that happens all the time. People can do that, right? And it's really in a very similar way, the same part of the brain exercising itself, right? Like it's where I think a lot of, like, you probably listen to a lot of sports commentating, right? And that, just the amount of just even passively absorbing that probably gave you a very good understanding what that rhythm needs to be, you know? And you can think critically about it afterwards, but while you're in the moment, you don't have time to do that, right? You're just shooting from the hip. So it has to be something that's embodied, like all of these things that work like that smoothly, right? It's like the more analysis you give it, the slower you have to be, right? You know, it's like that Heisenberg thing, right? Where if you know where the electron is, you actually have, like, perfectly, the information trades, right? It's like, do you want to know where it's going, or do you want to know where it is? Because if it's a blurred line, then that line points the trajectory of where it's going. Now we know where it's going. But now, where is the electron in that blurred line, right? But if we have a high enough frame rate where we can stop the electron perfectly, now we can see it exactly where it is. We have no idea where it's going, right? So, and it's one of those things where you can't have it both ways, right? It's like you either can move that quickly, right, without knowing where you are, which is, I think, what's going on, right? Or you know exactly where you are and you have to be very slow and you have no idea where you're going now, right? It's like, so it's kind of like, to me, that's true of all of these kind of like time pressure based, like real time things you got to do, right? Composing is actually way less stressful in that sense, because like no one cares how you get there, right? So if you're composing and you're coming up with a melody and you screw up 30 times, like no one knows that, right? It's just between you and yourself, right? So as long as at the end of the day you have the thing, there's actually way less time pressure. But it's like performing a concerto, especially if these people are paying good money to see it, they probably know the piece really well. You know what I mean? It's like there's no room for error. So it's part of the reason why I'm a composer, because I don't have that level of perfection in terms of like my real time sort of reactions are not. I just don't feel comfortable doing that. That's a feeling thing, and I just respect my feeling of like, yeah, I probably shouldn't do something that's like real time sensitive, you know. But yeah, I think sports commentary is, well, you know what? There's a bit of give and take, right? Because I think if you made a mistake, you can just, oh, actually, never mind. That was actually, you know, whereas like you can't do that if it's a concerto, you know, like you, yeah. So I don't know. So there's different tiers of the intensity of this, right? So
Yeah, and sports commentary for corrections, even then, there's a certain way to do it that doesn't make it sound like, oh, you're way off on that. It's
right.
You also have to do it in a way that's tasteful and also kind of pokes a bit of fun at yourself as well as a commentator.
Makes
so
sense.
yeah, absolutely on that point. And going back to just the composition process,
Yeah.
you had opportunities to compose for major game publishers. I mean, that's been much of the work that you've been doing in the recent years, including working for Capcom and Konami and even DreamWorks Pictures and Sony Pictures.
Yeah, yeah.
So what's the processes of composing for video games, and how do these differ and or similar to film score productions or standalone programmatic music or absolute music?
Yeah, there are more similarities and differences probably. Music is music at the end of the day, and your job is to, especially in game and film music, where the music is not the point. Like people are not going to the theaters just for the music, right? Like they might be also excited. There's a small portion of people's like, oh, Hans Zimmer did the soundtrack, I can't wait. Like, but like by and large, people are playing the video game to play the game, right? Watching the movie to watch the movie. So the music is there to be a wingman, to serve the narrative, to serve the experience, right? So, you know, it's a bonus if the music itself is separately satisfying, but that's not a requirement, right? The guy who's playing the game, who wants to have a lot of fun playing the game, will not have less fun if the music wasn't like perfect, or you know what I mean? Like if there's a kind of like, as long as the experience was very enjoyable in a holistic way, it to the overwhelming majority of people, like it just doesn't matter, you know. But what you're doing with the music in both film and movies is that you're optimizing the experience, right? So if it's a, let's say, I don't know, it's a sneaking mission, and it's largely, you don't see many enemies because the whole thing is very stealthy, and you're trying to there's some weird like back cave entrance into the secret layer that, like, you know what I mean, and you're like trying to hide behind crates. You don't know if there are enemies you don't see, and so there's not a lot going on in the gameplay perhaps, but the music is going to make you a little more skittish, right? So if the music is highly anxious, to enough of a degree, you're going to play a lot more cautiously, and now that affects the gameplay, right?
That's Metal Gear Solid.
Exactly, right? But look, actually in the PSX, like PS1 Metal Gear Solid, there's, because the hardware at the time was limited, it's like, you know, you can't have that many things on screen at once, right? Like it's like, and so it wasn't high enemy count. Like actually, it was a lot of it is, right, being really patient, and but the music really made you feel the anxiety of like, yeah, I better be extra careful and like tiptoe even when I don't need to, you know, like, and so yeah, I think a lot of it is having that imagination, like an accurate enough imagination of what the affect of something is, you know, and then being able to translate that. And that's not, in some ways, it's at once really easy to do because it's intuitive, but also when you try to understand what's happening, it seems like it would be impossible to do, right? It's like, how do you take something as amorphous as anxiety and translate it to something as mathematical as specific notes in a scale? You know what I mean? Like, you know, like it's like yeah, it would seem like an impossibility, but it's really not, if you're extremely familiar with the cause and effect of what music does, right? So yeah, so I think there's not there's not a lot of difference, right? Like you're still, it's still the same kind of empathy that you're largely exercising. It's just that with games, you're in a much more. The main difference is structural, right? So somebody who's, let's say, very good at the game might not spend that much time in that level, right? They may get out of there before the loop even happens. If they're really good at the game, or like, they don't even hear all the music. Fine, right? Or somebody who's really confused or really, really threatened by what the game is posing up as a challenge might be there for several loops worth, right? You know what I mean? So like your mileage may vary. And so with game music, you have to be always aware of the fact that the experience is that variable, right? Whereas in movies, it's not like this scene is 17 seconds. Your music is 17 seconds. That's it. Everyone experiences the same thing. So in games, it's like, unless it's a cutscene, which is fixed, right? The gameplay music is actually really fun to write because you need to maintain a certain kind of intensity level that's consistent. But then fighting against that is, well, your music can't be boring. You know what I mean? Like it has to be interesting to listen to, so that it's not annoyingly repetitive, but at the same time, you're in a pretty tight space. Like you can't escalate the music too much because that you're still here, right? A player who's stuck in the game might be here for a long time, and so there's a kind of, it's a different sort of set of boundaries to think about, right? But in some ways, the game stuff is more closer to natural music because it's like if the developer's like, hey, we need a 3-minute piece of music that loops, then you're just writing a 3-minute piece of music, not to anything specific, because it's just, you just know this is a dark and wet cave, and so it needs to sound a little bit threatening and sort of unsafe and mysterious, but like, but it has to feel cool too, right? Because you're sneaking, right? Like, there's those things, but like otherwise, just write music. But in film, it's going to be, oh, you know what? That and then the shot pans over here, and now we see that truck. So it's like, where you kind of have so many more very specific things to respond to at exact times, right? That the schedule of what happens in the music is highly predetermined, right? In games, there's a lot more freedom, so it's closer to just composing for composing's sake. So yeah, in many ways, that's probably why a lot of the game music is as satisfying as it is, right? Like even you think of like the Final Fantasies and all the kind of stuff that was really big. It's like they're allowed to write these like 4 to 5 minute cues that can do anything it wants in some ways, right? That you kind of can't get away with in film because it's like, well, the scene moves on, Yeah. So yeah, it's different. I think movies will reach higher emotional heights because of the highly coordinated nature of what's happening, right? And then the reveal happens at this moment, and the music is with it, and it's like, whoa, that punch, like the planets align, and this thing happens, right? In games, it's like, it's more serendipitous. It's like the player might do something really badass right at the moment that the music is also doing something really badass, and there's something kind of very sad, and then that's very personal to that one gamer's sort of experience. And so there's a bit more sort of like intended variability to the whole thing, right? And yeah, so I guess it's different in use case, but ultimately I think it's more, yeah. And the short of it is, I know it's a long answer. The short of it is just like it's more similar than not.
This concludes part 2 of The Legend of Aaron Tsang. If you enjoyed this part, smash the like button. To watch or listen to the previous part and to stay up to date for the upcoming parts, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and click on the bell notification icon. Also, follow the podcast on Spotify, Instagram, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.